Well, hello. So today we are checking out how France nearly ruled the world. The French Empire. This is coming from the channel This Is History. I'm kind of embarrassed because I did a I did a geography test the other day and accidentally clicked on France as Germany. You guys will see that in the video if you haven't already watched it. Super embarrassing, but you know, France, I've done a couple of videos on France, quite a few actually, and it is probably, is it the largest country in Europe? I kind of feel like it is. Like when you look at the land mass, it looks like it's one of the biggest. I know it has a massive history. Napoleon, 100-Year War, or is it 500-Year War? No, 200-Year War? Jesus. Gosh, what is going on with me? All right, so this is apparently about the French Empire, which dominated the world for a long time. And, you know, I lightly touched on this when I was in school. I don't remember that well, though. So I'm pretty pumped for this. You know what? Now that I'm actually looking at the map, I think the UK might be a little bit bigger in landmass wise. I don't know. This map looks weird. All right, neither here nor there. All right, smash the like button. Let's dive in. Oh, and by the way, if it's your first time here, my name's Jacob. And yes, obviously I'm an American. So if I don't have as much knowledge about Europe as you guys do, don't come at me. All right, I'm trying to learn. All right, let's dive in.
If you were asked to pick out France on a map, you would most likely choose this area in Europe, bounded by the waters of the Atlantic Ocean, the English Channel, and the Mediterranean Sea, as well as the land borders shared with Belgium, Luxembourg, Germany, Switzerland, Italy, Spain, and Andorra. You would also be right to point out the island of Corsica. However, this is not the only part of France that is separated from the mainland, for the nation's territory actually extends.
That's a part of France too? I didn't know that. What the heck?
Far beyond the confines of continental Europe. From the far-flung tropics of the Pacific to the dense rainforests of South America and the storm-battered coasts of Canada, there are 13 islands and territories scattered across the globe that are collectively referred to as France d'Outre-mer, or Overseas France.
Hold on. The French Southern and Antarctic lands. I didn't know that they had land down there. Obviously, Saint Martin, Guadeloupe. I feel like there's another little island down here in the Caribbean that they have, right? What is that? Maybe not. I feel like they might have shown it, but all right, let's keep going.
With a combined population of over 2.8 million people, these are the last imperial vestiges of France's once mighty colonial empire. In a period of little over 400 years, the zeal and daring of French explorers allowed the nation to exert its control and influence across many regions of the world, stretching from the Rocky Mountains all the way to Tahiti. But how did this empire, which at multiple times in history stood as the second largest in the world, become reduced to only a handful of sparsely populated and isolated territories? This is the history of the French Empire. The Kingdom of France at the beginning of the 16th century was one of, if not the, most powerful nations in Europe. Boasting a strong army and a well-developed economy, France stood fully poised to exploit the opportunities that had presented themselves with the recent discovery of the Americas. Despite this potential to become a colonial power, however, France's preliminary expeditions failed to achieve anything of great significance. The first of these ventures was led by Giovanni da Verrazzano in 1524, which mapped much of the Atlantic coast of North America, but failed to establish any settlements whatsoever in the process. The second expedition, led by Jacques Cartier 1 decade later in 1534, saw the St. Lawrence River explored and mapped by Europeans for the first time. Although the surrounding territory was claimed and christened as New France, the small fort established by Cartier's subsequent expedition to the area in 1541 ultimately came to nothing, as it had to be abandoned in less than 2 years. France's subsequent colonization efforts during the 16th century fared little better, for all the settlements were short-lived and ended in failure. Nicolas Durand de Villegagnon's expedition to Brazil in 1555 did initially establish a settlement within the bounds of the modern-day city of Rio de Janeiro. France Antarctique, as the colony became known, attracted a large number of French Protestants, called Huguenots, who were looking to escape persecution back home. The colony, however, would only last for some 12 years before it was conquered by the Catholic Portuguese in 1567. Further Huguenot voyages to the New World were championed by Gaspard de Coligny, a prominent leader of the Protestants who was also the Admiral of France. He envisaged establishing colonies as safe havens for his persecuted co-religionists, who could look to escape the increasing sectarian tensions in the country, which by 1562 had boiled over into outright conflict with the French wars of religion. He therefore organized 2 expeditions to what is now the southeastern United States. The first to be launched to what was then termed French Florida was led by Jean Ribaut in that same year.
French
But
Florida.
the small fort that his crew were able to construct in South Carolina, called Charles Fort, was quickly abandoned within a year. The second expedition was led by René Goulaine de Laudonnière in 1564 and resulted in another fortification called Fort Caroline, being built near what is now Jacksonville in Florida. This too did not last long, for it was annihilated by Spanish forces in the following year of 1565. In the wake of these persistent failings, a lack of enthusiasm for colonial enterprise took hold in France. Combined with the country's ongoing religious strife, this forced the authorities to focus most of their attention on domestic matters for the remaining years of the 16th century. It was only with the dawning of the 17th century that France began to pursue a more serious policy of colonization, after it was realized that within their territorial claims of New France were a magnitude of unexploited natural resources. Besides the vast quantities of fish in coastal waters, the interior of the territory was abundant in fur-bearing animals, especially the beaver, which were extremely valuable to traders back in Europe. Consequently, the French...
What? Beavers? Why were beavers popular with trading? Really? Beaver? Can't be because of the meat, right? There's got to be like, I'm trying to think, the fur? I don't know.
Crown decided to establish trading posts in the region, like that of Tadoussac in 1599 and Port Royal
This is why they speak,
in Nova Scotia
yeah, I was going to say, this is why they speak like a ton of French up in Canada, right?
in 1605. Further exploration and settlement of the St. Lawrence River followed in the early years of the 1600s, with Samuel de Champlain founding the city of Quebec in 1608, before venturing further westwards into the Great Lakes region and establishing a French presence there through forging alliances with several Native American tribes. Despite this progress, however, the colony of New France remained sparsely populated with European settlers and lacked development, especially when compared to the English colonies situated on America's eastern seaboard. In response to this, Cardinal Richelieu, the prominent advisor to King Louis XIII, founded the Company of 100 Associates, whose mission was to invest in New France's colonial projects, promising land parcels to settlers who could transform the territory into a thriving and prosperous colony. As a result, new settlements quickly followed at Green Bay, Trois-Rivières, and Montreal, which were all founded between 1630 and the early 1640s.
That's got to be such a crazy time, like living in France or pretty much anywhere in Europe and like hearing that there's a whole nother 2 continents across the ocean. And you're like, yeah, I want to go check it out. And like, I'm sure the likelihood of death was probably pretty high, but also that just sounds so, I don't know. I don't want to say fun. Just sounds like, I mean, at that time, there was probably a lot of people, it was their only option. As they said, I mean, there's always wars fought over religion and religious persecution. I mean, it still happens even today. Now we just look out into space and we're like, can we colonize another planet? We already finished this one.
Further development came in 1663, when New France was declared a royal province by King Louis XIV. He also sent a regiment of troops to the colony in 1665 to bolster security, and later, in a direct effort to increase the region's population, he sponsored the passage of young single women to the territory, who could then marry the colonial settlers. Between 1663 and 1672, some 800 women, known to history as the King's Daughters, traveled to New France and helped to raise the population from 3,200 to 6,700 within the same period.
Dang.
Although these
got
governmental
busy.
efforts brought progress, much of New France's real expansion was owed to the ambitions of the fur traders, who were continuously venturing further.
Okay, it was fur. The beaver was for fur. That seems like what was I don't even know. I'm like, how was fur like fur was an export? I guess when it's cold, but like there's other animals over on the other continents.
Further and further westward to seek out new sources of wealth to underpin the colony's success. In 1673,
By the way, you guys, I'm like kind of dumb when it comes to world history. I don't know a ton. You can thank my American school system. If you want to get on actual American history, which I mean, I guess this kind of is, but they didn't teach us this. I don't remember much of, obviously a lot of this is Canada, but yeah.
Expedition led by Louis Joliet and Jacques Marquette began to traverse the Mississippi River. They reached as far as the mouth of the Arkansas River before turning back, having learned that the great river ran towards the Gulf of Mexico and not towards the Pacific Ocean, as they had presumed. This feat was followed in 1682 by the expedition of René Robert Cavelier and the Italian Henri de Tonti, who traversed the entire length of the Mississippi to its delta, where they then planted a cross and a column to proclaim the whole area was now a possession of King Louis XIV. French colonial activity was by no means limited to North America, as like many European powers of the time, it sought to exert its influence on a truly global scale. Its presence in the Caribbean began in 1625, when Pierre Belin des Nambucq landed on St. Kitts and agreed to share the island with a small group of English settlers who had arrived at the same time. He returned to France the following year, and together with Cardinal Richelieu, organized the formation of a trading company that would eventually establish further French settlements across the Caribbean. By 1664,
I like how he says the Caribbean. It's funny. How wild would that be though to like leave France and then like you land on the Caribbean islands, and I just said Caribbean, the Caribbean islands, and you're just like, this is absolutely stunning. Like, I'm just gonna stay here.
France had secured possession of the islands of Guadeloupe, Martinique, Dominica, Grenada, Marie-Galante, Saint-Barthélemy, Sainte-Croix, St. Lucia, St. Martin, St. Vincent, and Tobago, as well as some partial control over the western half of Hispaniola, where French buccaneers had carved out a semi-independent colony.
I've stayed literally right then. No, this is Dominican Republic, right? I think I've stayed like right here on the north side. And then, is this Cuba? I'm used to them being labeled. Stayed at Jamaica too. It's just so beautiful.
Called Saint-Domingue.
God.
French traders and explorers also...
Wait, is St. Lucia still held by the French? I feel like it is, maybe?
...ventured along the northern coastline of South America during the early 17th century. However, the threats posed by the Dutch and the Portuguese in the region had prevented any settlements from taking hold. The French were eventually able to carve out a territory of their own just north of the equator, with what would eventually become French Guiana, and its capital, Cayenne, being founded in 1643. In addition to sending their own settlers across the Atlantic to populate the colonies of the New World, France participated in the transatlantic slave trade, like many of its European contemporaries. Countless enslaved Africans were brought in to work as laborers, primarily on the sugar plantations of the Caribbean. To support this practice, they also established a handful of colonies and trading posts on the West African coastline, with a presence in Senegal being founded around 1626. Similarly, France also gained influence around the Indian Ocean, with Madagascar and the Mascarene Islands seeing settlements by the mid-1640s. The English, Dutch, and Portuguese had already pioneered lucrative connections to the likes of India and Indonesia through the formation of their own respective East India companies. Not wanting to be outdone, King Henry IV established France's equivalent in 1604. However, its initial expeditions paled in comparison to their European counterparts for much of the early 17th century. They did, nevertheless, establish fortified trading posts on the Indian subcontinent, with Chandernagore and Pondicherry being founded in 1673 and 1674 respectively. As the 1600s drew to a close, France had carved out an empire stretching from the Rocky Mountains in the west to the Bay of Bengal in the east. However, the following century would see much of this progress undone, owing to a series of conflicts with France's age-old enemy, Britain. The first of these hostilities to break out was the
Yep.
War of the Spanish Succession in 1701. Although it was primarily fought in Europe, some action did take place in the Americas, and by its conclusion in 1714, Newfoundland, the Hudson Bay region, and Acadia, part of modern-day Nova Scotia, had been ceded to Britain, who also gained permanent control of St. Kitts in the Caribbean. A little over 30 years later, the War of the Austrian Succession broke out, which again saw fighting in Europe and North America, but also in India, where the interests of the two colonial powers collided. The end result by 1748 was largely inconclusive.
Humans are so dumb, dude. It's so crazy.
With what little gains either side had made being returned to their previous owners. This left many simmering tensions between France and Britain, particularly where their colonies bordered one another in North America and India, which both saw a continuation of small-scale fighting for many years after the conflict had officially ended. One such episode took place in 1754, where in the backwoods of Pennsylvania, a small company of British-American troops under the command of a young lieutenant colonel named George Washington engaged a party of French-Canadian soldiers who they believed were encroaching on their territory. This small skirmish snowballed into a wider colonial conflict and eventually culminated in the outbreak of the 7 Years' War, which was fought not only in America, but also across Europe, Asia, and Africa. Despite some initial French successes, Britain gained the upper hand in the later stages of the conflict and practically drove the French out of North America entirely by conquering New France, as well as most of their Caribbean islands. France also saw its influence on the Indian subcontinent greatly diminished, which all in all brought to an end what has been termed the First French Colonial Empire by 1763. Although France did retain some colonies, the misfortunes for its empire continued into the last decade of the 18th century, which were compounded by the outbreak of the French Revolution in 1789. Saint-Domingue,
Yep.
the richest and most
remember
important of France's
I remember that like I was there. No, I remember learning about that.
colonies, was ruptured by a massive slave revolt in 1791, and despite its repeated efforts to retake the colony, France was forced to capitulate and formally recognize the newly formed and independent nation of Haiti in 1804. Meanwhile, in North
Okay, I was looking at the wrong island. That's Haiti? Yeah, Haiti's on the other side of Dominican Republic. Okay, cool.
America, France had managed to secretly negotiate the recovery of the Louisiana Territory that it had lost in the aftermath of the 7 Years' War. Spain had ultimately taken possession of the region and agreed to exchange it for some parts of Italy that were under French control in 1800. However, Napoleon Bonaparte, who was on his ascent to becoming the Emperor of France, saw little value in the territory and agreed to sell it to the United States for a sum of $15 million in 1803. This injection of
wild.
cash into the French treasury could not have come at a better time, as the Napoleonic Wars broke out that same year. Although France was able to conquer and annex practically the entirety of the European continent within just a few years, the British once again capitalized on exploiting their isolated overseas colonies and captured most of them in the process. Although these were returned to French control at the end of the war in 1815, St. Lucia, Tobago, the Seychelles and Mauritius were not and were consequently absorbed into the British Empire. This
Okay.
continuing reduction in the number of French overseas possessions, coupled with the restoration of the monarchy under King Louis XVIII, spurred somewhat of a desire to recover colonial prestige in the following years of the 19th century. The Second French Colonial Empire began in 1830 with the invasion of Algeria and was later formally annexed in 1848, thus marking the beginning of French influence in Africa that would last for well over a century. During this period, known as the Scramble for Africa, many European colonial powers, including France, extended their influence and control over much of the continent. Senegal became a pivotal administrative hub in French West Africa, and in 1881, French hegemony was extended over Tunisia, further solidifying France's presence in the north and safeguarding its vital strategic interests. Continuing into the late 19th century, France intensified its colonial ambitions with the formation of the Federation of French West Africa in 1895, which centralized governance over territories such as Mali, the Ivory Coast, Guinea, and Burkina Faso. At the same time, they acquired Madagascar and Djibouti in 1896, before going on to form French Equatorial Africa in 1904, encompassing Gabon, Congo, Chad, and the Central African Republic. These acquisitions achieved...
I don't even know this. I don't know actual like French history that well. Did the French ever take slaves as well, like to France? I know that they were involved in the slave trade, but to America, or was it just like, yeah, they just did that for to make money off of it? Like they didn't actually take them back to the country. I don't think so.
France's strategic objectives in the region by bringing almost all the northern, western, and central portions of the continent under their control. A further addition to the empire was made in 1912, when France established a protectorate over Morocco alongside Spain. French colonial ambitions also extended into Southeast Asia, partly to uphold its self-perceived duty of protecting Catholic missionaries in countries such as Vietnam. In 1858, the Vietnamese emperor tried to expel the Catholics permanently from his kingdom, but Napoleon III responded by sending a naval force that captured Da Nang and Saigon, ultimately resulting in Cochinchina becoming a French territory by 1864. Later, France would expand its colonial holdings in the region to cover the entire eastern portion of Indochina by 1887, whilst also gaining control over some areas in Chinese cities like Shanghai and Tianjin. Meanwhile, French exploration of the Pacific Ocean, which had begun back in the 18th century, culminated in the annexation of New Caledonia in 1853, as well as Tahiti and its surrounding islands by 1880. As the 20th century began, France's colonial empire stood as the second largest on the planet, behind only that of Britain's. With the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, it relied heavily on the resources of its colonies, both in terms of manpower and materials, to support the war effort. Early on in the conflict, France began recruiting colonial soldiers, known as tirailleurs, who played significant roles in various campaigns. These troops were drawn primarily from North and West Africa, as well as Indochina, and were predominantly deployed on the Western Front, participating in major battles such as the Battle of the Marne, Verdun, and the Somme. After World War I, the French Empire reached its zenith, covering some 5.2 million square miles. This was helped by the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East, which allowed for the absorption of Lebanon and Syria, as well as ceding the former German possessions of Cameroon and Togo in Africa. The beginning of the end for the French colonial empire, however, would be brought about by the Second World War in 1939. With the surrender of France early on in the conflict, the colonies became divided between the Vichy regime and the Free French forces, led by Charles de Gaulle, who sought to continue the fight against the Axis powers. Like in the previous war, many colonial troops were called up for service and made enormous sacrifices for the mother country. However, after peace was restored in 1945, many within the colonies believed that France would offer them independence in gratitude for their service.
I'm guessing no, it didn't happen.
Charles de Gaulle, on the other hand, had no intention of liberating the colonies and instead assembled a conference of colonial governors to announce plans for a post-war union that would replace the empire. These plans angered many nationalist groups across the colonies and almost immediately led to calls for decolonization. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, many of France's colonies fought wars of independence against their colonial masters. These conflicts ranged from Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia in Indochina to Algeria and Madagascar in Africa, and were both costly and politically damaging for France. After eventually coming to terms with decolonization being inevitable, France began to engage in more peaceful independence negotiations by the 1970s. Consequently, the 30 or so French possessions that had existed in the aftermath of World War II were reduced to just 13 overseas regions and territories. Even though the physical boundaries of the French Empire no longer exist, one can still gain an understanding of how truly immense it was by looking at a map of where the French language continues to be predominantly spoken today. From Quebec and Louisiana in North America to Vietnam and Polynesia in the Pacific, there are over 238 million people around the world today who who speak French as either a first or second language.
Yeah, it's pretty wild that people speak French down in Louisiana. Not obviously the entire state, but there's a good part of the area that is still spoken with it's like a French English mix. We call Spanish and English together Spanglish. I don't know if you would call French and English Franglish.
This stands as a true and worthy testament to the spirit of those early French adventurers who set off centuries ago to explore lands unknown.
Wild. I know I didn't talk a lot in that one, but there was so much information that I was just so curious about that I kind of just got enthralled in it and totally forgot I was making a video. All right, I hope you guys enjoyed that one. I will see you in the next video. Peace.